With a few more people joining us, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. I think it is afternoon. No, about 2 minutes. I'm Sylvia Overly. I'm a member of the planning team for Faith in the City here at Knollwood. And we are so glad that you have joined us today. Along with our other planning team members, Dean Clifford, Diane Lipset, and Spence O'Neill, we welcome you. We are continuing to offer a hybrid format for our meeting. So we also welcome those joining us by Zoom. And we have a number of those logging on as we speak. We're so glad that we can continue to use our technology so that people outside of Winston-Salem or otherwise not able to attend can be part of Faith in the City. So we're just so glad that you're here today and look forward to greeting our special guests. In addition, we have two other special guests with us here today. Our school system leaders, Tricia McManus, our school superintendent for Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools. Also, Fabi Williams, the Deputy Superintendent for Schools. And we're so glad you are here with us today. And we know that our program over the last number of years has focused continually on educational equity issues. And we're glad to be in partnership with the school system and many others of you here in the room today. We appreciate your support. Before we begin our program, I have a few housekeeping matters. First of all, feel free to eat lunch. Cookies and drinks are in the back. And before you leave today, if you are not getting our emails and not part of our email list, please give us your information in the back. We want to continue to be in touch with you and include you in information about subsequent programs. If you're on the list, you don't have to sign in. There are no security measures to come here. We just welcome you. Today, we are so excited to feature a very important public exhibit about the history of integration in our public schools that has just opened at Union Station, which if you haven't been to Union Station, it's a beautifully renovated facility on Martin Luther King Drive near Winston-Salem State University. Rooted in Race, a community's journey to school integration is an interactive historical exhibit about local developments starting in the 1950s and continuing through the present. It is open for the next 3 weeks. But the hope is that it starts a continuing dialogue about equity in our schools and other changes in the community. Our guests for our conversation today are the people who were behind the exhibit as sponsors, coordinators, curators, historians, valuable parts of the exhibit. And so we look forward to hearing from them and discussing with them what they have gained and what we will gain from it as well. A few words of introduction. Layla Garms is the program officer for advancing equity in education at the Winston-Salem Foundation, a major sponsor of this exhibit. Layla is a native of Winston-Salem and a product of our local schools and has been with the foundation for 8 years. Cheryl Harry is the founding director of Triad Cultural Arts, whose mission is engaging the community in the preservation and celebration of Black heritage. Their signature event is one that you may be familiar with, the annual Juneteenth celebration, which commemorates a milestone in America's history, the abolishment of slavery. And so for the last 20 years, Cheryl has really been working through Triad Cultural Arts and others to impact our lives and educate us here in the community. She's also a native of Winston-Salem and is the author of Winston-Salem's African-American Legacy, which highlights significant contributions of local Black citizens through the years. Anita Justice has previously served as an educator for the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools, where she served in various roles, including language arts and social studies teacher, grade level facilitator, and yearbook advisor. She now serves as the historian in residence for Triad Cultural Arts and other curating roles. She's also and always has been interested in the inspiring and sometimes neglected stories that resonate within communities like ours. And so she has been integral in curating and gathering information for this exhibit, and you'll hear more about this. Leading us in conversation will be Dean Clifford, a member of the Faith of the City planning team and an advocate for educational equity issues here. And she was in roles in the school system during many of these years that we're talking about. So please join me in welcoming all of them to Faith in the City.
Before our panel starts, I want to just say a few things to get us started. I know you're going to see a timeline as the program unfolds, but I want to particularly highlight some things about the timeline in our own attempts to integrate our schools. In 1954, as all of you know, Brown versus the Board of Education declared that separate was inherently not equal, and that schools with all deliberate speed should begin integrating. Now, nobody realized just how deliberate that speed could be. There were many delaying tactics that went on in cities and states across the country. And so it wasn't really until the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which included a provision that districts that were not showing that they had integrated would lose federal funding. Now, years ago, when I was at Smart Start, a very wise parent said to me, "Dean, money talks and all else walks." In other words, sometimes the change only comes when money gets involved and requires that it happen. And so things began to get serious. And by 1971, after some token attempts before that, North Carolina schools began busing in order to integrate. And by the late 1980s, we were sort of at the peak of that process. However, in 1991, the Supreme Court ruled that court orders requiring desegregation weren't intended to be permanent. Well, that was like, go ahead and do your own thing, and things started sliding backwards pretty quickly. And here in Winston-Salem in 1995, the school choice plan was unveiled and implemented. So we're going to be hearing more about all that, but I wanted to be sure you had a few of those dates firmly fixed in your head and realized what a long journey this has been. The Winston-Salem Foundation and Triad Cultural Arts, with some support from the city, have given us a real gift in creating this interactive exhibit, a chance to really look back over our shoulders and say, how did we get here? How did this happen? Did we learn anything? Were there mistakes made, and what were they? How did this affect the people who had to live through it in their various roles, particularly the students and their families? So I'm hoping that as we listen to them, we can begin to learn from both the strategies that were used and still are, the mistakes that were made, and begin to reimagine how we could bring genuine equity and excellence for every single student served in our schools. I want to quote before they start from a research brief that was issued by the National Coalition on School Diversity in October of 2016. And they wrote, some 60 years ago, after the 1954 Brown decision declared separate schools inherently unequal, America's student population is much larger and more diverse than ever. For many decades, court-mandated desegregation plans were implemented, but now, today, public schools are again largely segregated by race, ethnicity, and family socioeconomic status. So we have gone backwards in terms of achieving equity, and in many cases, excellence. So today, we have invited our panel to start by just telling us a little bit about how did this exhibit come to mind for them? How did it begin? What were their roles in developing it? That's kind of the overarching question, but I'm sure you're going to also hear as they talk some of what they learned, some of the surprises as they delved into the history and began listening to the voices again. We neglected at the time to allow community voices to be heard sufficiently. They are bringing those voices back to life. And so we'll hear from Layla first, and then Anita, and then Cheryl. And I thank you for paying close attention to them. We will take questions afterwards, as well as having some that we sort of thought about ahead of time. So thank you for giving them your attention.
Thank you, Jean, again for that introduction. And again, I'm Layla Garms with the Winston-Salem Foundation. This exhibit really came about with some conversations that began happening about a year ago when we hosted the Undesign the Red Line exhibit, which was examining the practice of redlining in our community and the impact that it continues to have to this day. We started getting some questions about education and where, some of the decisions we've made about education over the years, how it was impacting some of the inequities that we see today. And because the foundation has a focus on advancing equity in education, this was something that was very much interest to us. Triad Cultural Arts has kind of been the go-to organization for local Black history in our community for decades. And so of course, Cheryl was an obvious choice for us in approaching a partner to help us think through this work. And Cheryl has been able to bring on so many amazing partners into this project, especially Anita Justice, who I'm eternally grateful for having gotten the chance and the honor of working with, and you'll get to hear from her shortly. Just a couple words about what we kind of hope to do with this exhibit. We really wanted to juxtapose current and former student experiences in an effort to identify areas of growth within local schools, as well as to name issues that continue to prevail for students of color. Through the exhibit, we hope to spark conversations about the community and our district and how we can move forward together in a more thoughtful and careful way to produce better outcomes for all students in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County schools and across our community. One of the primary objectives of this exhibit was to shed some light on the human cost of policies that we make over the years, the individuals that have to live out those policies. It was our hope that developing a deeper understanding of how individuals have been harmed by well-intentioned policies, arguably in the past, can lead to a greater sense of curiosity among Board of Education members and their constituents that support them about the stories behind the issues that are brought before them. We unveiled the exhibit officially in April of this year. It started out as a digital exhibit, and we were really excited over the weekend to open the physical exhibit, which is on view through November 12th, as Dean mentioned. And then hopefully, if there's a lot of interest and engagement from the community, we may be taking this show on the road. So more about that later if you all are interested. With that, I'll pass it over to Anita.
Thank you, Dean. Hello, everyone. I'm Anita Justice. Sometimes I say Anita Justice Patterson, and that's when my husband is present. But I like justice so much that I tend to stick with it. I'm happy to be here. I'm a person who has always been interested in museums and galleries and libraries. I would love to live in a library or gallery. I just love them that much. I'm particularly interested in artifacts and collections and how they should be used to help us better understand history. I believe that when we look at the artifacts, it helps us, number one, to understand self. It helps us to understand family. It helps us to understand community. And you know where I'm going with that, it helps us to understand our country. In the process of looking at artifacts, I've always wanted to make history come alive. And by that, I mean, how do we bring in the oral history stories? How do we bring in the voices? And how do we bring in the people who are an integral part of the history-making process? And then chronicle the history with primary source resources, newspapers, clippings, things that have been stored in a box, things that are in curios and cabinets, yearbooks and things of the sort. So that when someone sees history, they think about it as these are individuals who are sharing, who have shared, and who have done wonderful things to help us be the great country that we are. I come on board because I have taken artifacts to various places, genealogical societies, universities, and to the Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. I interviewed the professor, their primary scholar there, to talk about Juneteenth and the Constitution, and particularly the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, also known as the Reconstruction Amendments. So that when people hear a word like Juneteenth, they better understand that there's something about the Civil War, there's something about colored troops, and there's something about everyday people who were questioning the direction of the country. So I come on board because Cheryl has given me an opportunity to share a little bit of what I know and some of the collections to help as we look at history and try to make it alive and interesting and engaging for people. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So certainly a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Layla.
Thank you, Anita. I mean, they were excellent during this entire project. When we were approached by the foundation to curate the online exhibit, I like to tell people that we were very D&D, which is delighted and daunted. We had not really taken on an undertaking like this before to actually record something of this significance, this value that needed to be shared in our community. So we were led to the right people. Nita was one of those people. We are more creatives, like to think of myself as a creative. So our task was to create this engaging and immersive experience so that the viewer could actually feel through their devices, because remember, it was online at first, that they were a part of this story. So I love this quote, "The whole world watched and history remembered." So we wanted to show in a very real way what history recorded about integration or desegregation in Winston-Salem County, as well as the nation, how they grappled with that. The advantage for us is that we get to see it in hindsight. They were actually there, immersed in trying to do this hard work. And we get to sort of second guess everything that they did. But on top of that, we get to not make the same mistakes. We get to do a better job. So we had a creative team, Diaz Dobson and Reed. They're known as Dancing Grass. And they are just wonderful. So they came up with these colors. So through the exhibit, you're going to see a lot of black and white, which represents, the white represents the past. And of course, the yellow that you will see represents the change and the hope in our community. I'm going to attempt to sort of give you just a little glimpse of what the exhibit looks like. Okay, the exhibit has 3 components. The timeline, and the timeline follows the pathway of litigation, Negro schools and white schools, first Negro enrollments, and the struggle toward integration, inclusive of current students' perspectives. By exploring a lineal context of inequity, we also provide an opportunity to learn about the current community and school leaders at the forefront of reviewing structural discrepancies and advocating for change. So it's divided into decades. You will be able to go through the 1950s, and through that you'll have not only articles, you'll have interviews that have been interwoven into the exhibit. We have some key points that we really want people to hone in on in each era. Then we go into the 1960s, and we have different voices that speak to events that happened through these time periods. The 1970s, and as you can see, that is when, as Dean alluded to, that desegregation really took hold here. So we have a lot of people who wanted to share their thoughts here. Then we have the 1980s. Then there are the 90s. Then the 2000s, and we broke the 2000s up into the 2010s and into the 2020s. So I'm going through these rather quickly because I want you all to come and see this. Community voices was another component of the exhibit. Community voices travels to the lived experience through which these personal interviews will provide insights into the impact of desegregation on the African-American community, touching upon topics such as the emotional toll of separateness, wealth disparities, school district borders as well. So this was important because nobody really talked to the students. So we have the students who are now reflecting back on what that was like. We had a bunch of adults in rooms. Many of them did not want it to happen, but they did not really look at what was going on, what were happening to our young people. One of the voices mentioned, and that's Mary Labrador, who you see here. She was like, we were so young, they put us on buses at 5 o'clock in the morning. School buses were driven by 16-year-olds who just got their license the day before. What kind of people do this to children? So we're able to look back and reflect on instances like this. Dee Dee Adams, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, was one of the interviewees as well. And we had to get her tissue. She cried so intently because you're cultivating, you're bringing up some trauma that really hadn't been dealt with. And that's what this exhibit allowed also to happen. We definitely had to have Dean Clifford in here as we were going through, well, who do we need, whose voices do we need to hear? And there were a lot of them, and we could not get everybody. And the exhibit also opens up for more voices to be shared as well, but we knew that we had to have Dean Clifford and of course, Councilmember Scipio, who had done so much work on elementary schools, trying to get that history recorded. So we wanted those voices heard. And of course, the youth voices. So of course, just sort of listening to these adults talking about what happened to them, nobody giving sort of any account of their feelings. We wanted to try and make up for that or do the right thing. Let's hear what they're saying now. So we have 3 students who we really focus on, but also the Human Relations Department has a Youth Advisory Council. They did an hour-long exhibit on race relations in the school. So we have excerpts from that as well, and a way for you to watch the entire interview. Okay, and the most important part is the sharing. This exhibit provides an interactive opportunity for the openness of stories, feelings, and personal accounts. We ask that you visit the reflections room to write your stories, draw your memories, leave a message for an interviewee, share an experience related to the topic. And also, you can just share a card to say that I was there. So when you do a pop-up, of course, that means you don't have, it's not going to be up for always. So we've tried to pack a lot into these 3 weeks. The exhibit will be open during the week on Thursdays and Fridays from 10 to 1, and on Saturdays from 11 to 2, and that's October, of course, 29th through the 12th. We want to give the community an opportunity to really engage, so we've tried to do some focus Saturdays. On this coming Saturday, we're doing a student community talkback day, and we're doing this in collaboration with the Youth Advisory Council, as well as our Queen Juneteenth committee. And the students are just going to come in, view the exhibit, and it's going to be a student-led talkback. Voter education, the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority is doing a sort of a party at the polls. We're trying to get people to go vote. And that was one of the things about this exhibit. We wanted to affect policy. We wanted people to know that people who make these policies are the people that you voted for. So we wanted people to really look at the importance of voting. And then on the last Saturday, to close it out, we're going to focus on education justice. What's happening now? What's happening in the community? What's going on out there to ensure that there is equity in the schools? Are you coming back, Dee?
Before we open it for questions from you all, we thought it'd be good to ponder what kind of factors contributed to the failure of the implementation of integration. And I think there's a video that may speak to that. And then Anita, I think you might want to add to that too.
No, I had to go give instructions on showing the video. He told me this.
And help.
Brown versus Board of Education obviously was in 1954.
They fought against Lieutenant Governor Hodges, who became the governor when Governor Umstead passed, who put Thomas Pearsall.
About the Pearsall plan, I always want people to consider that it's not like someone knocked on the door and said, desegregation is coming. Well, they already knew. There have been cases that were explored. A case in particular is the Minister Mendez versus Westminster. That was a case in which Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP, which also worked on the Brown case, was heavily involved in that case. It was a case for the state of California, and the parents sued because they felt that their rights had been violated in terms of the 14th Amendment and the Constitution. So people were very much aware that there was going to be a strong effort nationally to make sure that schools were desegregated. And so what this plan did was to say, we heard what you said, 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, but we're just not going to do it because we're not ready. And so it's just a systematic effort to avoid it. The avoidance came in terms of saying, if we don't like what's going to happen, we will close our schools. But fortunately for North Carolina, they didn't have the emphasis and the anger and the violence of other places like Virginia. North Carolina just said, we're going to meet and discuss it and meet and discuss it again. So when groups came together, they even invited African Americans to attend. One of the committees contained 3 African Americans. All of the members said, not only should we not entertain this, we don't think it could ever happen. It's just totally impossible for this to happen. So what the Pearsall plan does, and the pupils plans, what they do is to say to the state, if we have to do something to integrate our schools, to desegregate, what we will do is allow people to come one by one. And many times when they tried to come, African Americans were told, well, this student has a C average, so we can't accept this person. If a person showed up with an A average, they said, oh, your average is too high, you may as well stay where you are. So one of the things that I enjoyed doing was to look at the history. And so there were many articles. Many of you may have heard the name Fan Brown before. So I looked at those articles. Cheryl had asked me to speak to O'Kelly Library at Winston-Salem State University, Tom Flynn. And I spent lots of days at the NC Collection Downtown Library, where I have all kinds of friends now, and I treat them to Starbucks coffee, so they'll help me delve into the history. But one of the most interesting things that I found, I have to always share with people that I'm never really shocked by what I found, because the history has been there and it has been there for some time. I'm one of those individuals who enjoys PBS. I thank those people who donate and who help fund. I love the documentaries, not to better understand what someone thinks, but you get a better opportunity to see the collections worldwide and then formulate your opinion. So one of the things that Tom did for me was to allow me into the archives area. And I saw a document and I copied it. This is a copy of a document from Francis Atkins. So Francis was one of the sons of Simon G. Atkins, and so that's a name that's very important to Winston-Salem. Simon G. Atkins was a legacy person, educator, a person who founded the Slater Academy, which is now Winston-Salem State University. And Francis attends a commencement address for Anderson High School. And in the address, he talks about his father, and it helped me to understand the local history when people say the problem has been funding and not funding adequately. So he tells the story of the superintendent who comes up to his dad, Simon, and says, we have spent money consolidating our white schools. We have modern schools. We have everything that we need. And so now I'm going to see what the colored schools need. Well, Francis notes that superintendent was in charge for over 10 years and he never did one thing for those colored schools. And he also notes, please keep in mind that all children deserve to have equal education and equal protection under law. So that was a local example of the big problem. The problem has been that when desegregation was mentioned, the notion for segregationists was, we deserve better. Better meant better schools, better opportunities for our children, better neighborhoods, and in no way should that include others. So when we talk about the African-American story, I always tell people that, yes, we know that this was the case for people who were called Indians. It was the case for people who were Latino. It was the case for people who were Mexican. It was also the case for people who were Chinese. But we're trying to tell the story of the local African-American history story. It doesn't negate anyone's story. It better emphasizes the fact that it has impacted so many cultures, so many people, and that everybody can relate if they first understand what their roles were in the story. The other things that I discovered was that when we look at, just as Cheryl mentioned, when we looked at the impact, we have to always really think about children. Linda Brown in Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, she's a third grader. She would have to take her little happy legs and walk about 7 miles to get on a bus to go to a Black school, where there was a school within 6 blocks of her home. So when the court decides that it is against the Constitution and against the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. So Blacks are given citizenship and they fight for those rights. The country does have trouble understanding separate or equal, but that comes before Brown. We start with Brown because it focuses specifically on education, but before Brown is Plessy versus Ferguson. There's already, after the Civil War, a Civil Rights Act that says, allow people who are traveling by train, by sea, of all colors, to have equal rights in terms of the city. So Plessy, who is, during that time in Louisiana, there were all kinds of codes and they would just note you by your complexion, how much blood you had, white blood. So Plessy would have been characterized as 7/8 white. Another term for him would have been an octoroon. And so he sat on the bus and he was arrested for doing so. The Supreme Court decided that separate is equal as long as the facilities are offering the same thing. Separate is never equal. The train station, Union Train Station, where Cheryl has designated this exhibit, is an example of separate or equal. So African Americans entered through a separate entrance. They walked on separate floors. They looked at separate chandeliers. And so separate said, you can have what we want you to have when we want you to have it. That was the segregationist notion. African American women could board trains and go in separate places if they were carrying a white child. And so the history tells us that the tone was, we don't have to fund or do anything as long as we have politicians, as long as we have reporters, and as long as we have those parents who are advocating for their wishes. So when people talk about desegregation and they ask, well, what went wrong? What went wrong is that you had a strong voice, many voices that were advocating for what they saw in their neighborhoods, in their backyard, their front yard, and they couldn't see the future. They couldn't see beyond what they were experiencing. Brown, that Brown family saw beyond his daughter, Linda. He saw the future. And on the heels of that, you also have a case in Charlotte. So in Charlotte, you get Swan versus Mecklenburg County. In that case, there were 10 families that were consolidating a case, and Brown there were 5. 1971 is what gives us the busing decision. And I would like to add that Charlotte and Mecklenburg from the time of desegregation up until about 2007, they decided as a city that one reason they believed that they were so vital in terms of making progress was because of their efforts to desegregate. But to desegregate, not just to move people, but to desegregate because they wanted to focus on the achievement of all students. I don't know what they say today, but that was the history. I think that when I look at the research, and I come back to that because that was my job, I think that when we look at the research, we see a history of people denying the rights of others because of the word better. They believed in their heads and in their hearts and in their souls that they were better, and it didn't matter how children were treated. It didn't matter that the facilities were inadequate. Many of the Negro schools were beyond dilapidated. Many of the schools would have been the equivalent of what people would have called lean-to shacks. Yet there were other schools that were outstanding. So I shared with you an article that I found when Tom Flynn allowed me to go into the archives at Winston-Salem State. And Simon G. Atkins, the Atkins High School here in Winston, is an exemplary model of what an African-American school was for African Americans. So that was built in the 1930s, maybe 1931. And what makes it such a wonderful landmark for Winston-Salem is that when we think about collaborative efforts where people come together to make change, a great example is Atkins High. That is the result of Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute and Julius Rosenwald. Some of you may remember getting those Sears and Roebuck catalogs. So Rosenwald was encouraged by Washington to try to seek funds to improve the status of Negro education. And so all over the South, they constructed what is called Rosenwald schools. So Atkins is now a landmark school that has been preserved. What makes it very important when I think about it is that for many of the Rosenwald schools, they were schools just to prepare African Americans for jobs, trade jobs. But this was one of the first schools that considered college preparatory classes, so that those students who were called Negro students would understand that they didn't just have to do manual labor, they could aspire higher by attending college. So that's just one example of what I've learned. And when we think about North Carolina, people are really excited to know that they didn't have violent uprisings. So yes, they had groups coming from Mississippi, white councils that met at the courthouse. Yes, they had groups that formed no busing our students. But when we look at other areas pertaining to busing like Boston and New York and maybe Louisville, Kentucky, it was just, I think about the Allstate commercial, it was just mayhem. Just people acting a fool. They were throwing rocks and things at children. The police had to board the buses. And so these little babies who were traipsing about trying to see their friends on the first day of school in their buttons and bows and ribbons and such were confronted with angry moms. And when we look at the history, I would invite people to just look at some of the pictures. And then when I go back to self and family and country, look at the pictures and then ask, what was your family's role? And if the role wasn't the way you think it should have been, maybe think about talking to people in your family about what you're doing now, how organizations and churches and people in communities meet, just as Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald met to ask how they could make things better.
Point of personal privilege. In 1963, I was a newly minted college graduate with my first teaching job at North Forsyth High School. I was very fortunate that it was the first year North opened. 3 different schools had come together, so nobody knew I was brand new. They probably picked it up pretty quickly. But at that point, we were engaged in the token efforts, where kids could perhaps, or parents could say, I want my child to go to that school. So we had a few kids coming in, but not by any token, real integration. Then as I left to start our family, and then later as our children were going to school, they were very involved in that strange period if you lived in Winston at this time. The busing was set up for K-4 schools to be on one side of town, 5-6 to be on the east side of town, 7-8 to be back on the west side of town, 9-10 to be back on the east side, and then finally 11-12 to be back in what had been formerly white schools. So my kids were very involved in that process of busing. Cheryl referred to the human cost associated with policies. Policies may be made behind closed doors, but the people that have to live with those policies pay the cost. But I would quickly say there's a big difference. When I look at my children, they didn't start having to be bused to a new area of town until they were in the 5th grade. Guess who had to start when they were in kindergarten? Going all the way across town into an unfamiliar area of town. And so there was a huge cost. And I want you all to help us reflect one of the most important or significant moments for me Saturday at the exhibit was listening to the voices of people who were students at the time and who experienced the changes. And I wonder, as you all were preparing this exhibit and delving into this, what were some of the themes, some of the things that stood out for you as you listened to those voices?
I can start and then I can pass it on down the road. I think one of the most poignant moments for me is hearing Black people talk about being in segregated schools and what a positive experience that was for many of them growing up in environments that nurtured them, that held them to very high expectations. And the education they were receiving against all odds was stellar. Many of the individuals that spoke on Saturday talked about getting to the white schools and realizing they were a year or two ahead of their white peers. And so I think that's one of the things that really gets lost when we talk about segregation versus desegregation. So we forget there was a lot of power in those Black schools. Had they had the resources, they could have very well educated and prepared those students in perpetuity, I think, for whatever they wanted to do going forward in life. And so I think that was a really important theme.
Yeah, Layla, one of the interviewees, white male that attended, went to Paisley where he said he had the best debate coach ever. And he was introduced to literature that he had not experienced. He, was familiar with George Washington Carver, he said his teacher made him read Richard Wright. And that book had a powerful impact on him, The Learning Tree. He talked about also the guidance counselor, and many of you know Adele Bird. And when we get back to that nurturing spirit from Black teachers and educators, he said that he felt like he was one of her children. She helped him through the process of getting accepted at UNC Chapel Hill. When he went and told her, he said, I felt like I was one of her children. She was that excited about like being accepted. So that nurturing, I think, was lost as well. It was so many things that sort of shone through. I guess the real human toll that it took on our students, it just made me think, and this may be a little far-fetched, but what the challenges that our nation are experiencing now is that some undealt with trauma. You sent students out of their neighborhoods. You put them on buses for an hour and a half, going one way, an hour and a half back. You made them feel like what they had was not theirs. So are they really trying to get back, get America back, get back? They felt like something was taken from them. And I just, when I thought back, I said, was this trauma that hadn't been dealt with? And how do we do that? Because there's so much chaos now, but it's because of past actions.
I agree. So there's really not too much to add to that because all of us are just stuck on the impact of students of all races. And particularly those first. We had to take that step. The journalist writes about Gwendolyn Bailey, the first to integrate at Reynolds High School. Her year is 1957. And the journalist does a good job of not just hammering, they did do this, and segregationists did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Instead, he says, she didn't go to the prom, couldn't go because she wouldn't be able to bring someone from her community to the prom. She couldn't go to the picnic because no one else would be allowed to attend those festivities with her. And so it's a lonely journey. And then that journey impacts so many people because once they decided to go into the corporate world or into other settings, once again, they were the lone person. When you walk in and you're the person who's the trailblazer. So I think about that total. So if I could add something to what they would add, what they've said is that when Cheryl asked people to come and tell their story, I was just so excited about that because even though I've been in the community, when you're working with the school system, you are really working. You are really working from sunrise to sunset. And so when the administration comes through the building, you usually just get to say hello because you have to get back to your classes or you have to go work on your lesson plan. So this is one of the rare times when Cheryl asked these voices to come and tell their story. We were at the Enterprise Center, Simon G. Atkins Enterprise Center, and Harold Montague Davis, who was an assistant administrator, and she ended her career at Carver High School. She looked at me, she said, well, I'm here because Cheryl asked me to come. And we do what she asked us to do. And Commissioner Fleming walked in with his hat. Dr. Simonton came in looking GQ. And I was like, oh my. as my younger sister says, oh, snooky now. So they came in and they were so proud, despite the fact that they had to go back and relive these experiences. They were so proud of the opportunity to come in and be engaged and tell their stories. So what sticks with me is just their willingness to share with the hope that it would help future generations. And that someone finally asked, what was it like for you to walk those halls? What was it like for you to bear all of this pressure? And there's other footage and other things that haven't even been uploaded yet. One of the families where several kids were at different schools and they were the first to kind of come in. I was surprised when I listened to the videotape that they never went home and discussed it. So when they talk about the trauma, these were kids who endured all of this and they were afraid to go home and tell mom or dad because they didn't want to bother them. They were told to go and that's what they did. They didn't even talk to their siblings. I was one that I came home and I told everything. Who said what and how they looked at me, but they didn't even share. And so when they told the stories on Saturday, it was amazing. And the other thing that stuck with me was that so many of them are still contributing in a vital way to the communities. When you think about the roll call, Mayor Pro Tem Dee Adams, Councilmember Scipio, it just goes on and on. So not only have they just done so much, even those people who weren't the first, the people in the school system who had to go through these policy changes of being the first African-American, that's a lot of pressure. It's just a lot of pressure. And it's just amazing the lives and the careers that they still have.
Some years ago, in Smart Start days, I got to know an African-American obstetrician from another part of the state. He'd grown up in Eastern North Carolina. He was a medical doctor. One of the brothers was a lawyer. Another brother was a professor in a college. He told me a little bit about his background and growing up with very little materials, resources, a single mom. And then he expressed concern about what was happening to kids today. And I said, he's my age. I said, we grew up in the days of segregation. So tell me why you're more concerned about kids now. He said, well, when I was in school, as I walked home every day, the community stopped me and asked me what I got on my test. The community told me what they expected from me. The community said, tell your mama that you did so-and-so. The community was solidly behind me. And as I listened to some of those community voices, that was what I was hearing. So I think the question for all of us today that care about our schools is how do we recapture the ability to create that sense of community and care for every child where they feel that nurturing that you all are describing? Because that was really a standout Saturday as I listened to people talk about their experience in what were then Black schools. And so I think today the challenge is, can we be creative enough to figure out a new way forward that really does create that kind of nurturing environment for children? And we've done a lot of talking and we're about out of time, but is there a question bubbling around out here that you haven't been able to ask before we run out completely of time? Yes.
I don't have a question, but after doing the exhibit Saturday, one thing that stood out was Mr. Wayne Ledbetter. He was the last class of Anderson, 1970. It's also my mother's class. And what he talked about was our schools different, yeah, but are they better? And he said that story is still being written. And the fact that if you don't visit and understand history is bound to repeat itself. And if you read some of that between the 70s to the 2000s, it's already repeated itself. Not saying whether it's good or bad, but it has repeated itself. And so we definitely have to get back to community and asking the children, instead of making decisions for them all the time, asking the students what they need. Because that is what has been missing throughout the segregation or desegregation And current, we rarely ask the students. We are starting to ask them, but even in being asked, they're like, well, did anybody listen? Because nothing that we say is being put into action. We have to not only ask, but listen and implement something that students are asking.
Somehow the challenge for each of us is to make sure that those decisions that are made behind closed doors are open to the voices from the community and are listening, as she said, to what people need and want. Any other questions?
I just have a comment. One of the programs, one of the emphasis that Cheryl and Layla have placed on the project is to, just as you said, to make sure that students have an opportunity to come to the center to learn the history and to sit in circles and discuss what schooling is like for them. So many of them have diverse friendships and great relationships. And so it's really good to listen to them. And I also want to say, just in terms of platforms such as this, Faith in the City, I've been here, I've met with Reverend Catherine before, and Cheryl reached out to someone who's a member of the church, and we were thinking about how can we take all this information and put it in a capsule so that we have just key points or significant elements. There's a member of this congregation that said, I will look at the research and I will help with the points. So it begins with people being willing to volunteer, to talk to children, talk to adults, and say, let's come together so that we can all understand the history. I don't know if she would want her name mentioned, but we appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. Other question, yes.
What's the likelihood that this will return as a standard thing, that it just be a part of?
I'm sorry, say that again. What's the likelihood?
The pop-up exhibit, what's the likelihood that this will be a permanent?
Okay, that's for you, Art. How likely is it that this will be permanent?
We are so trying to have an African American Heritage Center in Winston-Salem. If you look around, it's missing. The story may have been told earlier had we had one, but thanks to people like the foundation. So we do plan, Layla really wants the exhibit to be shown again. Mayor Pro Tem Adams wants it for Black History Month. So talk to the foundation and see what this.
And I do want to encourage every one of you to go. The challenge for us today was not to come in here and tell you everything in the exhibit, so then you wouldn't want to go. It was to try to tease you into going, because it is a rich source of information and material. The challenge is you can't just go and breeze along and get out. You know, there was a program Saturday, and then I didn't have time to do all the buttons and hear everything. So give yourself some time to really enjoy the rich assortment of material and voices that they've got. Can we thank her? Go ahead.
Can I add quickly to that? As I mentioned, the foundation really would like to, this exhibit was designed to be a pop-up style so that we can take it out into community. So if there's interest in that, that's something that we really would like to do. We'd like to bring it to the constituents. So it just depends on how well visited and well received it is over the next couple of weeks. But assuming that it's successful, there will be opportunities to view again in 2023.
Superintendent.
Yeah.
Again, 81 schools did it pop up into federal benefits from.
So in every school, there you go.
Yes. We love that.
Thank you. Join us again in thanking our panelists, please. I'm getting a wonderful job. I was touched by Gabby when I was there, and I was equally touched today. Just powerful words. And if you go and on a card say, we need this permanent, we need to be in 82 schools and churches and other areas, we think that can happen. Thank you very much. And we appreciate your continued support for Faith in the City. Next month, on December the 6th, the first Tuesday in December, we're looking forward to highlighting the school system's new student code of conduct and asking questions and learning about these new approaches to accountability and restorative practices in the school climate. So look for more information. We hope you will join us on December 6th. Make sure if we don't have your email, leave it at the back because we want to be in touch with you. We will share this video with you and please share it with others. Thank you so much for coming.
Brown versus Board of Education obviously was in 1954.
They fought against Lieutenant Governor Hodges, who became the governor when Governor Umstead passed, who put Thomas Pearsall in charge of finding out how we're going to make Brown versus Board work in North Carolina. His whole thing was, if they force integration on us, they're going to destroy the public school system, which was the mantra of a lot of white Southerners during that time. It's not that we're against integration, just let us do it at our own pace. And they came up with a lot of different things to fight against integration. The Pearsall Plan was one of them.
The public schools of North Carolina are part and parcel of our state and its great progress. But let no one be misled as to how I personally feel about mixing the races in the school. I'm unalterably opposed to it, and I intend to continue seeing that our state uses every lawful and proper means to prevent it. And the recommendations made by our committee furnish us the best possible means of keeping our schools and keeping them segregated.